Hopefully my message this morning will go better than my introduction. This is the first time I've taught since we made some changes to the Sunday service, and before the service, Brian sat me down and coached me through what I was supposed to do, and I still messed it up. I think it's funny, but I don't know if you think it's funny. I'm still messing it up. I have a green light up here. This is not going very well so far.
We still love you.
Testing 1, 2, 3. I have green light. It was not my fault. Testing 1, 2, 3. There I am. Thank you, Brian. Thank you very much. Yes. Okay. The text I want to start with today is a very familiar text, 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 31. Hopefully we're familiar with this text. So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do it for the glory of God. Sorry. I'm back. Okay. Thank you. Testing 1, 2, 3. Okay. I can do this without a mic if I have to. All right. So whatever you do, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do everything for the glory of God. What does that mean? You know, this is the primary purpose of our life. Everything we do, the reason that God has us living on this earth is for this right here, to glorify Him. Everything else is a means to an end. Raising our kids, doing church, going to work, it's all just a means to this end, to glorify God. And whenever we're not glorifying God, we're not fulfilling the purpose that God has for us living here. This will matter for all of eternity. The Bible tells us that this glory that we give God during this life is going to be rewarded in the next life, and that our resurrected bodies are going to have a certain glory to them. And Paul says our resurrected bodies are going to be like the stars in the sky. Some of them are going to burn brighter than others, even for all of eternity. And you're going to be walking on the new earth, and you're going to see somebody who's like, whoa, they're so bright. And you're going to ask them, what did you do for God to shine like that? This glory is going to be forever that we glorify God with on this earth. What does it mean to glorify God? Well, glory is the revelation of someone's greatness to inspire awe. And that's what we do for God when we glorify Him. We reveal His greatness to others so that they are in awe of Him. I have a challenging question for you this morning. How much have you done to glorify God with your life? Now, when I ask that question, it can sound a little condemning, because I imagine most of you are thinking, not very much, Pastor. I hope by the end of this message, I've corrected your thinking, that you actually realize you glorify God a lot. So the purpose of my primary point this morning is that God rewards what glorifies Him. What God rewards, He rewards it because that's what glorifies Him. And this is what gives us a clue in the Bible as to all the different ways that we glorify God when we see all the things that He rewards. So one of the things that you need to understand this morning is that there are two ways that we glorify God with our life: publicly and privately. And some of you have heard this message before, in this theology before. And I just want to remind you of these things because it's so important for your life. Some of you haven't heard these concepts before, and I wanted to introduce you to them. Publicly glorifying God is when we glorify God because of what people see us do. That's when we publicly glorify God, is when people see us do something for God. We privately glorify God when God sees what we do and people don't see it at all. Well, we can both types of glory are in the Bible, and Jesus actually talked about both these kinds of glorifying God in this Sermon on the Mount. The very first sermon He gave, He talked both about publicly glorifying God and privately glorifying God. Let's talk about publicly glorifying God first. Jesus in Matthew chapter 5, verse 16 said, "So in the same way, let your light shine before men, that they may see your good deeds," people seeing your good deeds, "so that they may glorify," the Greek there can mean praise, "your Father in heaven," because of what you're doing, what they see you doing, and how it's blessed their life and changed their life. They're thanking God for what you've done. And that publicly glorifies God because of what those people are seeing. Now, I've experienced some of this in my life and ministry, and I want to describe some of that to you this morning. And I don't want you to think I'm doing this to boast about myself. I'm doing it to make an important point that I want to make later about what it means to glorify God. But let's take a moment to think about what it might look like to publicly glorify God. Last year was a highlight of my over 30 years of ministry. I was in India and Nepal for about 5 weeks. And I went to Nepal first, and as is his habit, Chairman Hannock took me to the remotest parts of Nepal, to the mountains, where we went to a place where the gospel had just been introduced to this area in the mountains the year before. And God was doing amazing things there. We were baptizing people, and they had announced that there was this American guy that had come to the mountains and, come here and preach, and people were coming. They were walking for miles to get to this place. And when that happens, you're thinking, okay, Kurt, this better be good. Well, this really elderly man walked up to me and my translator, and he said, "I know you." And I thought, well, maybe he had heard me teach at a pastor's conference there in Nepal before. I'd taught at many pastor's conferences over the last few years there. Maybe he'd met me there. And he went to his bag and he pulled out this book. And of course, it was my Christian Essentials book. And they put my picture on the back of that book. And he said, "No, this is you, yes?" Yeah. Well, nobody there knew how this guy had even gotten this book, because it hadn't been distributed in that area yet. I was told later this guy was over 80 years old. He walked for several miles to get there because he wanted to meet me. And through my translator, he just went on and on about how this book had blessed his life. And he talked about how I have so often thanked God for you, and my family has prayed for you. The next day, we ordained that man as an elder in that area because of all the work he'd been doing. He's a pastor now, and to my understanding, the only seminary textbook he's got is my Christian Essentials. Jesus said, "Let your light shine before men, that they may see your good deeds and glorify and praise God for what you're doing for them." And I'll never forget that man. I was just flabbergasted as he just spoke to me through my translator. I'll never forget the man from the mountain in Nepal. Well, we left that area. We went to a pastor's conference in Pokhara, large city. It was a large pastor's conference, about 250 pastors there. And so I'm there to speak for 2 or 3 days, and Dr. Subhash from India had now joined me in Nepal. And there's a pastor up front introducing me. And again, through my translator, he's just going on and on about all this stuff about me. It was a little embarrassing. I didn't really realize what kind of impact the books were having, the conferences were having. And this guy kind of spelled all that out. And then he gets to the end of my introduction. He says, "And we also have Dr. Subhash here." That was it. That's all he said. I turned to Dr. Subhash and said, "I guess I'm the big shot here." And he laughed. He wasn't offended by that at all because he understood what I was saying. You see, when I travel with Dr. Subhash in India, he's really the big shot. He's known everywhere. And the only reason I have any ministry in India is because of his reputation, his recommendation of me. So it just felt weird. He's just not very well known in that area. And so God was just, during that trip, was just kind of revealing to me the work that he has been doing there through our church and through our ministry in Nepal. I had no idea of what had been happening there. And so finally we arrived at the National Annual Pastors Conference for the Natural Churches Fellowship of Nepal there. They were expecting 710 attendees. As we're traveling, Chairman Hannock got word there's actually like 900 people coming, so he's on the phone scrambling to get more housing, and it ended up there was over 1,200 people there. It was the largest gathering of Christian leaders in the country of Nepal in all of its history. And it was a tremendous honor to be there. And I get to the conference site, I walk into the conference site, and I look over, and there's a book table stacked high with my books, and they're just passing them out free to everybody. And I thought about you. The reason they could translate and publish and distribute all those books free was because of your generosity. You paid for all of that. And everybody had a copy of my book. And so as you're walking along, people are greeting you. They're thanking you for your ministry. Many of them had already met me at conferences that I've done throughout the years there. And for the first time in my life, I felt a little bit like a celebrity. And it was not really all that comfortable, to be honest with you. I'm more of an introvert. I'd rather be in my private study than on a stage, usually most days. And it just felt a little weird because, again, I just didn't realize what was going on there. Well, I look at the program, the speaking program, and I notice a couple of things. Number one, every single guy in the program has doctor in front of his name instead of me, except for me. And that was a good thing because in India and Nepal, they always, when they introduce me, they call me Dr. Jurgensmeer. That's what they call me over there. And I keep telling them, I'm not a doctor. I don't have any theology or ministry degrees at all. But they keep calling me Dr. Jurgensmeer whenever they introduce me. But they got it right on the program, so I was glad to see that. Second thing I noticed was that there were some well-known Christians on this list of speakers. One of them was the deputy director of the World Evangelical Association. So the World Evangelical Association is the association in the world that's over all the evangelicals of the world. And it was a big deal to have the deputy director there. And the reason he was there is that the Christian world is finally starting to recognize what God is doing in Nepal. And that's why he wanted to be there. And it was a great honor to have him there. And I noticed on the program that it was only he and myself who had 2 teaching slots. And in that context where you've got, 1,200 pastors, all of them want to be up front to speak. And you get 2 teaching slots at an event like that with the deputy director of the World Evangelical Association. Okay, I got it. That was a great honor to have that. And I gave my second teaching slot to Dr. Subhash. I thought I'd return the favor. He's given me so many opportunities in India to speak. But so I've told this story before, but I turned to my friend Harka and I said, Harka, why do I have 2 teaching slots? And he said, Kurt, you have done more for the churches in Nepal than all of these men. Oh, again. Just like, are you kidding? He wasn't kidding. I know Harka enough. He wasn't flattering me. He's very familiar with what's going on in Nepal. He was just telling me the truth. And it was, again, very humbling to hear that from him and to think about that. And I did not realize that. And of course, I'm sure he had in mind all the money that our church has given to the churches in Nepal. And perhaps he was thinking about the books because he has been at the forefront of translating and publishing and distributing those books. I'm sure he was thinking about all those things. But I believe him. Well, it was my turn to teach, and every single one of the foreign teachers there from another country, they brought them up before they spoke, and they gave them a traditional Nepali hat. I have several of them. I've been given those. And they would introduce them. And it was the MC of the conference. I'd never met this man before. He was introducing these speakers. And once again, when I got up there, it was Chairman Hannock himself that wanted to introduce me. And again, he went on and on about what our church has done in Nepal and the conferences we've done, the books and all that. And he pulls out a different kind of hat. Now, the best that I can understand is that this was a military beret from the Nepali Special Forces. And he put that on my head, and you could just, it was something special. He intended it to be something special. And of course, he led that audience in a great round of applause. And I'm sure these other foreign speakers are thinking, who is this guy? They'd never heard of me before. And it was a very humbling time. And I got up to speak, and I thought of a few things. First, I thought, this better be good, Kurt. And I also thought about, here I am. This is a mountaintop of my 30 years of ministry right here, in front of some of the most dedicated, sacrificial Christians I've ever met in my life. It's very, very humbling to speak to them. And I guess that's what it looks like to publicly glorify God, doesn't it? Let your light shine before others that they may see your good deeds and glorify, praise your Father in heaven. And these people all know. They know that I do my ministry for God. It's not for myself. And they tell me repeatedly that we believe God sent you here to minister to us and teach us. And all of that praise for me ultimately goes to God and glorifies him. And that's publicly glorifying God. And it's a little weird, actually. When I come home, I'm just Kurt. Not even usually Pastor Kurt, just Kurt. I don't have any notoriety in the Christian community of Lynn County. But over there, I'm Dr. Jurgensmeer. And evidently, I have some notoriety with a few thousand pastors that I've had the great, great privilege of teaching over the years. Why have I shared this with you? Well, I want you to understand, this message is not about me. It's about you. It's about you. I hope you get that by the time I'm done. I've shared all that to set you up for a couple of questions. Question number one. Do you think my life has glorified God more than yours? I think many of you are thinking something like this. Well, of course, Pastor, I'm just a stay-at-home mom. Or I'm just an engineer. Or I'm just retired. Of course your life is glorifying God more than mine. I hope by the end of this message you understand differently. That from God's perspective, the difference between you and I is really nothing. There's not much difference. You glorify God a lot. Second question here. Do people need to see what you do for God in order for you to glorify God? In other words, if people don't see what you're doing for God, like those guys in Nepal, if the people don't see what you're doing for God, they don't appreciate what you're doing for God, they don't thank you for what you're doing for God, does that mean that you don't glorify God? Thankfully, the answer is absolutely not. Publicly glorifying God is just one way that we glorify God. And in fact, it's not even the most important way that we glorify God. And that's good news because not very many of us have the opportunity to even experience being a little famous. Doesn't happen. The most important way we glorify God, brothers and sisters, please understand this, is not because of what people see. It's because of what God sees you do. And Jesus talks about that later in the Sermon on the Mount. So Matthew 5, he shares about public glory, but starting in Matthew chapter 6, he starts talking about private glory. Verse 1, be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. Well, let's be reminded our motives matter. Why are we doing what we're doing? That's what God cares about. He doesn't really care about what we're doing. It doesn't really matter if you're on the stage or if you're in nursery back there. Why are you doing what you're doing? That's what God cares about. And it's a reminder that even doing righteous looking things, if we're not doing it for the right reasons, it doesn't please God and doesn't glorify him. Remember my primary point though, what God rewards glorifies him. So let's read on in verses 3 and 4. What God rewards, he rewards it because it glorifies him. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. Did you catch that? What he sees you do in secret, That's what he's going to reward you for. Why? Because it glorifies him. Do people need to see what you do for God in order for you to glorify him? No. No. We constantly, privately glorify God by every act of faith, every act of love, every act of righteousness that we do for him. He's watching, and it glorifies him all day long. Please understand that. Jesus goes on to describe another way we glorify God. When you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. Why? Because just praying glorifies God. I hope you get that. Every time you've prayed, God has recorded that. He has seen that. He will reward you for it, regardless of how he answers that prayer. And you taking the time to humble yourself before God and to pray glorified him. Glorified him in a way that you may not understand yet. I want to give you a verse in the New Testament that some ways illustrates what I'm talking about. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, Paul's talking about all the trials that he's having, that he's a fool for Christ, that he's dishonored in his ministry, he's hungry and thirsty, all these things going on in his ministry. And then he writes this in verse 9. He says, "For it seems to me that God has put us apostles on display at the end of the procession, like those condemned to die in the arena. We've been made a spectacle to the whole universe, to angels as well as to human beings." Did you see that? Paul understood, I'm living my life on a stage. I'm being watched, not just by people. In fact, he says later in the passage, I don't care what people think of me. But he said, you know what? Angels are watching my life. Why? To see if I'll glorify God. Now, next week when I teach on the book of Job, you'll see this even more clearly, what I'm talking about. The fact that we are living our life on a stage, and it's for the glory of God, and it really matters. Every little thing we do and every little thing we suffer for him, it matters immensely because it all glorifies God. Brothers and sisters, you're being watched. You're being watched to see how you will glorify God. So, this theology of privately glorifying God, quite frankly, I haven't met very many Christians that even understand this. When I teach it elsewhere, other places, they've never heard of it before. They've never even thought about this before. They think the only way you can glorify God is people have to see what you do. Thank God that's not true. In fact, think of the text I began this message with. 1 Corinthians 10:31. So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. Think about that. There's a command here for you to glorify God in whatever you do. Everything you do is supposed to glorify God. Now, how would that even be possible if it requires that people see what you do and appreciate what you do and thank God for what you do? That very rarely ever happens. That's only happened a few times in my life. No. The primary way that we glorify God is not because of what people see. It's not on the stage. It's in the everyday Christian faith that we exercise in our lives, that God sees, that the angels see, that the devil and demons see, that glorifies God every day in your life, that private glory. That's how you can glorify God in whatever you do, even by how you eat and drink. How can you possibly glorify God with how you eat and drink? Well, one way is we give thanks to God for what we're eating. How many people in this world every day eat and eat and eat and eat and eat and never thank God? Have never thanked God for their food. We thank him all the time. And it glorifies him. You don't know how much that glorifies him. So when we are evaluating the glory that is being produced by our lives, We have to view all of this from God's perspective instead of the world's perspective to see this. We need what I call glory glasses. What do I mean by that? Well, let's imagine that you go to this Christian conference. There's this big shot speaking there. He's a very famous evangelist. Maybe he's on television. And you go there, and there's several thousand people there. And the lights are on this guy, and he's funny, and he's sharing some truth from the Bible. He's talking about Jesus. Well, then he's kind of slipping in this stuff about being healthy and wealthy because you have, great faith. But you're looking at this from a worldly perspective. You think, oh my goodness, there's a lot of glory going on here on this stage. And then you put your glory glasses on. And you see things from God's perspective, and the whole place goes dark. Because God knows that's just a wolf in sheep's clothing up there. He's not even a Christian. He's a false teacher. Now, people love him. They adore him. They give a bunch of money to him because they hope they can get a private jet like he has. That's going on all over the world. And it does not glorify God. In fact, with your glory glasses, you can look up into the rafters of the auditorium, this guy's speaking, and you see the demons sitting up there laughing and cackling because of how all of that glorifies the devil. Well, what if then after that you would go to a Nepali prison and visit a pastor who's there, who's been put in prison. He's been there for a while just because he shared the gospel with somebody. And you come up to his jail cell, and it's just a concrete floor with a cot and a little bucket in the corner for him to go to the bathroom in. That's all he's got. And he's sitting there in that corner of that concrete prison cell with these prison clothes on. You look at that with the world's eyes, you think, how pathetic. How pathetic. And then you put your glory glasses on, and bang! Whoa! You can't even look in that cell anymore. It's shining as bright as the sun. All of the glory that is coming from that prison cell. Why? Because that pastor is sitting in that corner, and he's just thanking God for his life. And he's praying for his family and his church. He can't minister to them anymore. He doesn't have a ministry anymore. It's been taken completely away from him. He can't even love his family and his wife anymore. And by the way, I've met Nepali pastors who have experienced this very thing I'm talking about. He can't serve them anymore. He can't love them anymore, but he can pray for them, and he prays for them. And the glory that comes from that prison cell would blind you. I want to end this morning by reminding you of all the ways that you glorify God. In Sermon on the Mount, Jesus talked about giving in secret will be rewarded by him because he sees it and because it glorifies him. Brothers and sisters, every cent you've ever given to the kingdom of God has glorified him. And you've given a lot. Jesus said, if your Father sees you praying, it glorifies him. Because how many people in this world are actually praying? He said, if you're fasting, God sees it. It glorifies him. I think of Saturday mornings, every Saturday morning for the last few years here. About a dozen men or so have gathered here in this auditorium right here every Saturday morning. Again, I say it like this before. They give the first half hour of their free week right here on Saturday morning to pray, not even for themselves, but to pray for you, to pray for the world, to pray for others. I'm telling you, the glory that is shining on Saturday mornings from New Life Community Church because of those men who are gathered here, it would blind you if you had your glory glasses on. Blind you. Most Christians think it's just the big public things that people do for God that glorifies God. No, this is not what Jesus taught us. Do you know how easy it is to actually glorify God? Let me demonstrate this to you. Matthew 10:42, you know this verse. If anyone gives even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones who is my disciple, truly I tell you, that person will certainly not lose their reward. My goodness, you're going to get rewarded for whatever cup of cold water you've given somebody. That little thing right there. God saw it. He's going to reward you for it. Why? Because it glorified him. Because it was an act of love. Nobody else in this world is loving people like we do. God sees it. He will reward it because it glorifies him. Even these little things. Are you beginning to see it, Christian? How much your life really, truly glorifies God? Moms and dads, how many cups of cold water have you given to your kids? I mean, a bunch. And you did it because you love them. And when you start adding up all the things you just do for your kids every day, every week, oh my goodness. The balance sheet on that is huge. All of those acts of love, they all will be rewarded. They've all been recorded, and they all glorify God. It doesn't matter what people see or what people think. It doesn't even matter if your kids ever thank you for all those things, because they probably won't. God saw them. You did it out of love, and it glorified God. I'm going to talk more about that in a couple weeks on Mother's Day. Guys, just getting up to work tomorrow morning, to faithfully go to work, to support your family, to serve the people at your workplace, to glorify God in your workplace, all of that, God sees it, and it glorifies God. Every act of faith and love and sacrifice that we do, it will be rewarded because it all glorifies God. I want you to think about what is happening right now this morning. Think about this. Where is the glory of God shining the brightest this morning, right now? Is it on this stage where I'm speaking and you're listening to me and you've got your attention focused on me? I don't think so. I think it's in the back here, where there are people who have volunteered to take care of our kids, to love our kids, to teach our kids and grandchildren. That's where the glory of God is shining the brightest. I think God's focus is actually more back there than it is right here. That's what I believe. It's easy to think that those in full-time ministry like myself are glorifying God the most. But most of you don't understand the sacrifices that are made by a bivocational pastor like Pastor Brian. All week long, he works hard in a very demanding job for a Fortune 500 company, and then usually devotes almost his entire weekend to serving us at this church. And we pay him just a teeny tiny little bit. So essentially, he's constantly working for us for free. All the teaching he does, all the meetings he does, all the counseling he does it basically for free, and even refuses to be paid more. I'm telling you, if you had your glory glasses on, you would see the glory that comes from that man's life more than he even realizes. So I want you to put your glory glasses on for me this morning, and I want you to look around this auditorium for just a moment, okay? If you had your glory glasses on this morning, who in this auditorium would be shining the brightest? If you are 60 years old or older, would you please stand? I know you don't want to. Just get up. I'm telling you. I'm looking at some of you. You're not 60. I thought you were over 60 years old. Okay, if you're not, that's fine. I'm telling you. This is what I believe. These people right here. They stand up in the back there. Okay. These are the people, as God looks down this congregation with his glory glasses on, these are the people who shine the brightest. Do you know why? Because they've just been doing this for longer than the rest of us. They have been worshiping God, serving God, loving people, long before some of you were even born. And even right now, I'm telling you, the angels that have been watching them their whole life, they're just clapping. They're clapping. So let's just join them for a minute, okay? Let's thank these people. You may be seated. I want to say something to the older people in our congregation. You have forgotten most of the things you've done for God. You have forgotten most of the things you've done for your kids, most of the things you've done for your churches that you've been in, most of the money you've given, you've forgotten all that. God has not forgotten it. He has recorded it. He's going to reward you for all eternity. And it has greatly glorified God. Please know that. and they're still worshiping God and loving people and serving God in, quite frankly, bodies that are breaking down. Now, I'm 58 years old, and every day now, something on my body hurts. I can't imagine trying to serve God and love people in a body that's 10, 15, 20 years older. That right there requires some faith, brothers and sisters. It does, in a way we may not understand. I think it's just sad that young people look at old people with the world's glasses and they just see these frail people who don't look very productive anymore. I mean, how valuable can they really be? A lot of old people, even Christian old people, are just kind of tucked away quietly in a nursing home somewhere, and everyone has forgotten what they did for God, what they did for their kids, what they did for other people. God has not forgotten that. God has not forgotten that. And we don't want to forget that. So I have a couple of requests. Let me end with a couple of requests this morning. Would you older saints be willing to tell us a little bit more about your story sometime? Here's my second request. If some of you younger people would be willing to interview our older saints and just ask them a few simple questions, nothing big. Questions like, what is the hardest thing you ever had to do for God? What is the greatest miracle God did in your life? What are some ways you serve God and love people? And what would you say to younger Christians about what it requires to serve God and love people for so many years? What has that been like? I'd like to collect those answers of all of that God-glorifying wisdom and experience and print it up and make it available to the rest of our congregation for their encouragement and instruction. Listen, we're going to be doing this when you die at your funeral. We'll be celebrating your life, talking about how great you were, all the things you did. Well, let's do it now. Amen. Let's celebrate your life now. That's what I'd like to do. So if you'd be willing to interview some people here, just ask me a few simple questions, record some answers, email me at kurt@newlifecr.com. Kurt@newlifecr.com. I'd like to hook you up, and I will encourage these old people to meet with you, okay? They're not going to want to, but they'll obey their pastor and they'll do it. So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do it all for the glory of God, because you can. He's watching. And this is the greatest purpose and the reason that we are living. Thank God we can glorify him in everything that we do. And so how do we evaluate how much we're glorifying God? Again, my primary point, what God rewards glorifies him. If it's something he's going to reward you for, then it's because it's something that glorified him. Then please leave here today thinking about all the little things you've done to serve God and love people. It's all glorified him. So have I changed your mind about this? Do you still think you've done so little to glorify God in your life? I hope not. Because the truth is that your life has glorified God much, much more than you realize. Amen? Okay, take a minute with the person next to you to talk about what God spoke to you through this message, or you can just pray, thank God for these things, and I'll be up here in just a minute to dismiss us.